I believe we are live. Let us check YouTube. Not yet. Okay. Stephen Giger has joined us on the Facebook side. Who else is with us? Where are you tuning in from? Hopefully we don't have a problem on the YouTube side. There we go. All right. Stephen is in from Dover, New Hampshire. James is in from Indianapolis. How are you all doing? Yesterday I forgot to light my candle. Let me not do that again. We are lighting up the darkness. Okay. Sandra Brand is with us from Bogota, Colombia. Bienvenida. Ian Chamberlain says hi from Phoenix. Moshe Hernandez says hi from Bogota. Wow, two people separate. Are you together? From Bogota, Colombia. Bienvenidos. Brandon Christian Sullivan from Tennessee. Jeffrey Summer from Hayward, California. Donna Smith in the house from Bahama, North Carolina. Wonderful. It's great to have you all here. And Neil is in the house from Virginia. Wonderful. Okay. Janice Beanstalk just joined with us. Nina's in the house. If you have comments or questions, put them in the comments. Nina will be checking it throughout the class. And toward the end, as always, I'll address the comments and questions that she puts before me. Kelly Marie Ryan says hello from Portland, Oregon. All right, lots of states, even a few different countries and continents. Let us get into it. We are on Daf Kuf Gimel, page 103 of Tractate Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 12. Today we'll finish our discussion of the first Mishnah of chapter 12 and the second Mishnah and get into the third Mishnah. A lot of ground to cover. Let's do it. Yesterday, we were talking a little bit about the difference and the way we apply it between makeh bepatish and boneh. So makeh bepatish is striking a hammer blow, but really it means striking the final blow. And often things which amount to makeh bepatish, to striking the final blow, you would think that they would fall under the category of prohibitions, of prohibited labors of Shabbos, the category called boneh, building, right? So if we're doing something, we're building something, we're creating a utensil, we're creating a house, things that look and feel like construction, one of those activities, which certainly feel like construction, like hammering something, might be the last step in the production process. If so, even though it is boneh, even though it is building, it's going to be referred to now, it's going to come under a separate category of makeh bepatish, striking the final blow. And it makes sense because if it's the final step that one has to do in order to finish the object, well then, until that point, you were in the process of creating something. And once you strike the final blow, so now the thing is here. It's been created. It's no longer, in process. I think anybody who's an artist hears this and has to chuckle a little bit because there's that old saying that no work of art is ever finished. It's only abandoned. So, is something really the final blow? And so that's why we get into certain, definitions, like in other words, defined terms, that even though there might be some, somebody might come back and make further adjustments to the object in question. If, for example, a person chisels stone, he takes a hammer and chisel to a piece of stone, there might be a whole lot of other work to do to get that stone ready, for example, to be inserted into a wall. But any act of chiseling is going to be deemed by our sages to be striking the final blow, because at any moment the rock exists, right? I mean, if you think about somebody who's putting a clock together, okay, I mean, there's just so many steps, and clearly along the way, well, when he's in the process of building that clock, there's just a lot more to do, and the clock won't function until he's done. But when you chisel a stone, every time you chisel off a piece of that stone, the stone is there. It is a stone, and it could be used in a fence that required a stone of that size. How do we know that this is the halacha? This was a disagreement between Rav and Shmuel. As we saw yesterday, they disagreed on various things, and Rav always said, no, that's boneh, that's building. And Shmuel was of the position, no, that's striking the final blow. So they talked about chiseling a stone, they talked about making a hole in a chicken coop, and they talked about, for example, the handle that gets inserted into a broom or a shovel, that you put a peg sort of that connects the handle to the utensil end, right? The handle of the shovel, and imagine putting a peg, through the receptacle in the shovel that receives the handle, and now the peg is going to, fix the handle to the shovel. Rav said that's building. Shmuel said that's striking the final blow. And the reason we follow Shmuel is because two later and very prominent sages, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan, and particularly Rabbi Yochanan, held like Shmuel on this issue. And how do we know? It's actually brought down here in our daf. How do we know that Rabbi Yochanan held like Shmuel on this question? Because he was asked in his Beis Midrash, in his study hall, by, who was it that brought the question? Rav Nassan bar Oshaya. So when Rav Nassan bar Oshaya brought this question about chiseling a stone to Rabbi Yochanan, and he said, is it boneh, building, or makeh bepatish, striking the final blow? And Rabbi Yochanan went like this. He didn't even say anything. He just went, and he indicated clearly, the gesture was clear to all, that falls under the category of striking the final blow. Why didn't Rabbi Yochanan say it out loud? Perhaps he was involved in prayer and he wasn't going to interrupt his prayer. He heard the question. He was able to answer with a gesture. And so he did answer with a gesture. I think we can learn, the fewer words we speak and maintain clarity, probably the better. And certainly that's a good lesson for me, who tends to be a little bit verbose. So let's move on. Okay, we also hear on this daf that drilling a hole is makeh bepatish, at least some kind of drilling a hole. Now this one is surprising because when you're drilling a hole, presumably something's going to go in that hole. So when we drill a hole, it's to prepare for some further step. So how can drilling a hole be striking the final blow? There's another step to come. It's not the final blow. So here, the Gemara clarifies and says, drilling a hole is equivalent to striking the final blow when the hole is made with a screw that fills the hole, right? So I remember that at the hardware store at one time I bought, because I was lazy, you could either drill a hole with a drill bit, and then, that's just a little bit smaller than the screws that you want to use to attach two pieces of wood. You drill the hole between the two pieces, and then you take your screwdriver and insert the screw to keep those two things together. But if you're lazy, you can get the self-tapping screw. And now this screw has like a little drill bit on the end. And so you don't have to drill a hole first. You just get your power drill with a screwdriver head, and you just and the screw itself creates the hole that the screw will sit in. And that's exactly the case that's being mentioned here in our daf. Then we have a curious case, because we're told that striking an anvil is a forbidden labor, and in fact is striking the final blow. Now this is odd, because now you're thinking maybe in a blacksmith shop, right? Okay, so we understand that when the blacksmith is taking the red hot iron, maybe he's creating a sword, maybe he's creating a horseshoe, and now he's going to take his hammer, his heavy hammer, and the anvil is there, and he puts, he holds with his tongs that red hot piece of iron that he pulled out of the furnace, and he's hammering that iron until it takes shape. That makes sense. Clearly he's fashioning, and at some point it's the final blow. But when he just strikes the anvil with his hammer, and there is no red hot iron, there is no utensil, there's no piece of iron that he's hammering into shape, what's going on? Why is this a forbidden labor at all? He's not creating anything. Why would he be liable for violating? Now, this is all assuming he's doing these things on Shabbos. That's why we're saying that it's prohibited. So, I mean, you can certainly strike the final blow or build or do, any of these creative labors during the week. Let's just be specific. We're talking about this is prohibited on Shabbos. So why is it prohibited to strike the anvil with his hammer when he's not creating anything? He's just hitting the anvil. You would think that this would be permitted. But we hear that he's chayav, he's liable. So it's not only prohibited, but he's going to be liable to bring a sin offering for violating a biblical prohibition by striking his anvil with his hammer. Why? This is the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, that he's liable for striking the anvil. And the later sages wonder about this. So Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef say, the reason that he's liable is because he's training his hand. Right? This is a craftsman who wants to be good at his art. So by striking the anvil repeatedly, he's training, he's practicing. He's making his arm stronger, and he's learning the practice of striking so that he can do a good job when there's actually a piece of iron, the red hot iron, that he's trying to form into a horseshoe. The sons of Rechava find this answer unacceptable. They say, if what he's doing is learning how to be a better blacksmith, are you then saying that a person who watches another person, let's say that a Jewish blacksmith guy who wants to become a blacksmith on Shabbos happens to be walking past a non-Jewish guy who's working on Shabbos, he doesn't have to desist from his labor on Shabbos. Shabbos is incumbent on Jews. It's a commandment for Jews. So the non-Jew is working in his blacksmith shop. The Jew comes along on Shabbos and watches him work. He's learning about the practice of being a blacksmith. Is he liable for violating Shabbos? I mean, according to this theory, that the guy who just strikes the anvil with a hammer and isn't creating anything, isn't fashioning anything, isn't doing any kind of creative endeavor, he's just striking the hammer on the anvil. If the reason he's liable is because he's learning his craft, then this guy who's just watching a blacksmith work on Shabbos would be liable also. And we know, the sages instinctively knew, you can't be liable just for watching something, so that's not going to work. So then Abaye and Rava said, no. It's not that he's learning his craft, and that's why he's going to be liable. It's that he's striking the anvil in order to fix the hammer, right? And so you can imagine that they didn't have the such excellent processes as we have today in terms of tempering steel and making it strong. And so perhaps a hammer, a heavy hammer that's been used a lot for whatever, the craftsman is using it for, after a while, the surface of the hammer can become a little crooked or uneven. And he strikes the anvil actually to get the hammer, the surface of the hammer, back into a nice flat plane. And so now it makes sense. That is part of his building process. You might think it's boneh. You might think that it should be prohibited because he's building, but it's not. What he's doing is refinishing the hammer itself. And that's why it's makeh b'patish. It's striking the final blow when he's actually striking blows on the anvil, because he's using it to adjust his hammer. And likewise, we would learn from this that you can't sharpen a knife on Shabbos, right? Because if you're sharpening the knife, it's like you're refinishing that blade, and it's a refinish. In other words, you're striking the final blow on the blade. But it's not because you're just trying to become a better hammerer. And so now I'm speculating. I'm not sure, and you cannot rely on me for this. But I did a little research, and my question was, can a guy who's into golf just take practice swings in his backyard? If he's hitting balls, it's going to become problematic. Sports on Shabbos is problematic. The rulings that I can see is some are stringent on this and some are lenient. There's still somewhat of a division of opinion. Most people are stringent and say you shouldn't be playing ball sports on Shabbos. And maybe it's okay for kids under bar mitzvah age, but once they get older, there's problems. We're going to get away from... Certainly there's a problem if they're carrying the ball in a place where there's no eruv. But even if we assume that they're in a private domain or that they're in a public domain and surrounded by an eruv, or a place that becomes a private domain, it's still going to be problematic for a few reasons. If you want to play sports on Shabbos, definitely ask your rabbi about that. There also seems to be a distinction between a pickup game, which may be a little bit more allowed, than an organized game that people plan to attend. That's definitely problematic. But when you talk about just a guy in his backyard taking practice swings with a golf club, right, that seems to be like the one who's practicing and not creating anything. He's not hitting a ball. He's not hitting it out of his property. There's no transfer. He's getting better at his craft of golf. And let's assume he's not even a professional golfer, so it's not like work. Some would say this isn't Shabbos stick. It's not really conducive to Shabbos. Another problem would be if when he's taking his practice swings, he makes furrows in the ground, if he takes a divot. Now, if it's not his intention to create the divot, so Rabbi Shimon would say that's an unintended consequence and we're not concerned about that. But if he always takes divots, if it's inevitable that he's going to take a divot, well, then that divot is like creating a furrow. It's like plowing on Shabbos, and that definitely would be a problem. But if the divot is not inevitable, he's not hitting a ball, he's just taking practice swings, so it sounds, a little bit like striking the anvil, which you can't do because it fixes the hammer. But if there's no anvil, if he's just swinging the hammer to get better at swinging the hammer, that seems to be okay. And so perhaps swinging the golf club just to swing it without hitting anything and without creating an inevitable divot seems to be okay. All right. Now we go to Mishnah number 2. One who plows, weeds, or prunes. So any kind of farming or gardening or fixing your yard, the minimum measure to become liable to bring the sin offering for an unwitting violation of this prohibited labor, the minimum measure is any amount. You cannot do it. You can't prune your roses. You can't prune a tree. You can't improve your garden in any way. The other day we had a question, can you pick an apple off a tree? No, you cannot. That is reaping. If you gather sticks from the yard, there's a muktzah problem. Those weren't prepared for Shabbos, so you shouldn't be touching them anyway. If for some reason it's okay to gather wood without the muktzah issue, then the minimum measure would be enough to cook an egg, right? Burning enough wood that if you burned it, it would be enough to cook an egg. if you pick grass any amount, because it's understood that when you pull grass out of the ground, that's actually good for the grass, because more grass will grow in its place, and it's a form of renewing the lawn, as it were. And so here the example is given, one who picks reeds, right? One who cuts some reeds. I mean, aside from the reaping issue, if you prune, right? If you just prune some reeds, it depends why you cut those reeds. I guess maybe the reeds is not like harvesting, but I think it is. I'm not sure why they're talking about that pruning is going to, the minimum measure for pruning is going to depend on why you're cutting those reeds. If it's for you to eat, so then the minimum measure is the volume of a dried fig, if it's for a human to eat. If you're going to use it to feed an animal, then the minimum measure is enough to fill a goat's mouth. If you're going to burn it as fuel, then the minimum measure is enough to cook an egg. But if you're going to just use it because your property looks a little scraggly and you just want to trim some of these reeds so that it'll look more sightly, it'll look better, so then you violate Shabbos by cutting any amount of those reeds. You cannot do that on Shabbos. So now that we're talking about that, there's different measures, different minimum measures, depending on what your intent is in cutting those reeds, the Gemara objects, but the land is always enhanced, right? Anytime you cut anything in a garden, it's understood to be good for the garden. It's good for your lawn to trim anything as part of your lawn. So since it's always going to enhance the land, and the minimum measure for enhancing the land is any amount, what difference does it make that you're cutting some of these reeds in order to eat them, or in order to feed an animal, or in order to use them as fuel? So Rabbi Shimon might answer, and we've seen this many times, Rabbi Shimon, who disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda, that an unintended consequence of a permitted labor, if the unintended consequence is a prohibited labor, we don't worry about it because that was not your intent. The classic example is moving furniture across a dirt floor. It will create a furrow. So Rabbi Yehuda prohibits this on Shabbos. Rabbi Shimon permits because the furrow that's created in the dirt floor is not what you intended. You're not moving the furniture in order to create a furrow. You're moving the furniture to enhance your enjoyment of Shabbos. So Rabbi Shimon says the unintended consequence is unimportant. The caveat to Rabbi Shimon's ruling is if the furrow is inevitable. And the principle is sometimes stated as, if you cut off its head, will it not die? Like maybe you're cutting off the head, of whatever you're talking about, the insect, because you need the head for something, and you don't care if the animal dies, if the insect dies, you're not trying to slaughter the insect. But if you cut off its head, it's obviously going to die. That's an inevitable consequence. And if there's an inevitable and prohibited consequence, then you're not going to be permitted to do that permitted activity. So here, isn't it inevitable that when you prune or cut a few reeds in the yard, that the yard is going to be enhanced? So what difference does it make what your goal is in doing the trimming, and the fact that there might be larger minimum measures than any amount, since for sure you're going to enhance the land anyway? And then the Gemara answers, but if you're gathering these reeds not on your own property, so you don't care if the land is enhanced. Maybe you're doing it in a public place where it's legal to cut a few reeds, or on your neighbor's property where there's a general permission for you to do that, so you're not stealing. So then in that case, those minimum measures would apply. Even though the land is enhanced, it's not enhanced for you. Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 12. It is prohibited to write on Shabbos. Writing is one of the 39 prohibited labors on Shabbos. Recall, all of the prohibited labors on Shabbos derive from the labors necessary to build the tabernacle when the children of Israel were in the wilderness. Writing was one of the things that was necessary to build the tabernacle. And you can imagine that. You know, they made some blueprints, right? It was a very elaborate tabernacle that they built. And as they set out to build that project, they took notes and they made blueprints and they made plans and they shared, you know, materials lists and to-do lists, etc. So writing is prohibited on Shabbos. What is the minimum measure that one becomes liable to bring the sin offering for violating the Torah prohibition of writing on Shabbos? Answer: the minimum measure is 2 letters. If you write any 2 letters, and here the sages are going to be talking in Hebrew, this would apply in English also, any 2 letters in Hebrew or in any language with any kind of ink makes you liable. Rabbi Yosef tells us in the Mishnah that the only reason that writing is prohibited on Shabbos, it's not what I just said, that, well, they had all kinds of to-do lists and there was a lot of other writing. Rabbi Yosef suggests that it was only because of marking. And so there's a difference between kosev, writing, and roshain. Am I saying it right? Yeah, roshain. Marking, right? So the difference between writing and marking. What is he talking about? So the tabernacle was all these beautiful curtains and then the coverings of the tabernacle that made it a beautiful large tent. It was basically a tent. The tabernacle was a tent. But its skeleton, its main structure, was the beams of the tabernacle. And there were a whole lot of heavy beams that were transported by the Levites from location to location, and then they would go to set up the tabernacle. And even though the beams were all the same size as each other, there were little nuances of difference just because they were all handmade. And the first time they were put together, every one of those beams was put in a place, and then they, sanded it and made it perfect so that it would have a perfect fit to its neighbor. Each beam had a perfect fit with its neighboring beams. And then what did they do? They marked them so they would know which beam goes where. And it was these markings where there were, alignment marks between, each beam and its neighbor. So according to Rabbi Yosef, it's the marking that is really the root of this prohibition on writing, and the minimum measure is any 2 letters. So, according to Rabbi Yosef, so markings are also any kind of markings that you make on Shabbos that's gonna make you liable to bring the sin offering for violating this Torah prohibition. And it makes sense. And there seems to be a difference between if you were aimlessly just doodling for a moment. Now, you shouldn't pick up a writing instrument on Shabbos. You're already violating the rabbinic decree of muktzah, that if you pick it up, right? So a pen has no legitimate use on Shabbos, so you shouldn't pick it up. You shouldn't be writing. If you did pick it up and you weren't thinking about it and you started doodling, so maybe you would be exempt because the doodle has no meaning. But if you were thinking to yourself, unwittingly you forgot it was Shabbos and you were just thinking, I want to come back here later and I want to, I don't know, whatever it is, I'm gonna place something in this spot and I don't want to forget that this is the spot that I've picked, and so I make a marking, even a dot, but it has a purpose. So then that's going to be significant enough. If it's a marking with a purpose, is going to make you liable to bring the sin offering. But there are going to be, now in the Gemara's discussion of this Mishnah, there's going to be a little bit of pullback and say, okay, you're going to be liable for 2 letters, but first of all, you have to be writing in the typical way. So a right-handed person writes with his right hand. If for some reason there was an emergency and you needed to do a little bit of writing, to save a life, well, then you could do anything. But if you had just like a strong need and it wasn't to save a life, but for some reason you felt like you had to do this and you didn't want to violate the Torah prohibition, any writing you do is going to violate the rabbinic decree. But if you at least you want to avoid violating the biblical prohibition, so if you're a right-handed person, you could write in an atypical manner with your left hand, signaling to everyone around you that you understand you're not supposed to be writing. There's just some, immediate need that you're going to give into. If you're an ambidextrous person who can write with either hand, so then you're liable for violating the prohibition if you write with either hand. Interestingly, the minimum measure is 2 letters, but just like a doodle might make you exempt, but a marking with a purpose will make you liable, 2 letters that are just random letters are not going to make you liable. But 2 letters that have a meaning. And, there's plenty of 2-letter words in English. There's more 2-letter words in Hebrew, just because there's sort of implied vowels and whatnot. But for example, the example that's given is the name Shimon. So the first 2 letters of the name Shimon are Shin and Mem. So if you're planning to write Shimon, which has 5 letters in it, you're going to become liable for violating Shabbos, even if you don't fulfill your plan of writing that 5-letter name, but you only write the first 2 letters. But the reason you're going to be liable is because those 2 letters, Shin, Mem, do spell a word, Shem, all right, who was one of the sons of Noah. So the 2 letters can't just make a nonsense word. In order to be liable for violating the biblical prohibition, those 2 letters have to have some meaning in themselves. It may not be a word. The example that's given in the Gemara here is Aleph, Aleph. So that's the first letter of the alphabet, Aleph. It's a silent letter, but that little sequence, Aleph, Aleph, is used in some amulets, right? And so because it has a meaning, even though it's not a word, one is going to be liable if he writes Aleph, Aleph. And the basic idea of, why 2 letters that form a word? Because there's an underlying principle here that's in this chapter 12 with any of these things, right? With building, striking the final blow, writing, pruning, weeding, etc. You're going to create something. It's a productive labor that endures, right? So a doodle would be thought to not endure because it's meaningless and no one's going to care. But something that's a word has this quality of enduring. It's going to last. It's going to be used for something. It's going to be referred to. Somebody's going to look at it and ascribe a meaning to it. Okay, that is what I've got for us today. Let's look at some comments and questions. Mike Schofler, welcome. It's great to have you here. Cool story on the gesture of striking the final blow. How much of the Talmud's Laconic Style is a moral lesson on speaking less versus a better way to convey thought on complex topics? It's a great question, Mike. And I'm not sure I would use the word laconic because sometimes it's quite emotional. And sages, will even sort of like, how could you say that? And even, call each other names. Like your teacher must have been a reed cutter in a swamp, things like that. But I certainly would characterize it as terse, particularly in the Mishnah. And here we have to understand that it's written, in this thick book, right? And there's 70 books like it that comprise the Babylonian Talmud. It seems like a massive piece of writing, but it's not. It's not really a piece of writing. The Talmud was eventually set down because there was fear that the Roman persecution would be so intense that we'd all be killed, or particularly that our leaders would be killed, the rabbis would be killed. And they wanted to record for posterity their teachings, so at least somebody in a later time when it was more peaceful would have access to all this information. However, it's an oral tradition. It has always been meant to be an oral tradition. At Mount Sinai, there were 2 halves, 2 co-equal and joined halves of the Torah that were given, the written Torah and the oral Torah. So the tradition began at Mount Sinai. The writing is the Torah. The writing is scripture. The oral tradition is an interpretation. There are certain traditions we wouldn't even know from the written Torah, like what is tefillin, what is matzah, etc. There's just a lot of things that aren't defined in the written Torah, and we only know what they are from the oral tradition. But the oral tradition is also a process, and that process was crucial because it was known to God and to Moses that the world would keep changing. And what was imaginable at Mount Sinai, 3,300 years ago, what was visible and imaginable in the world did not include stuff that would be in the world 500 years later, and 1,000 years later, and 2,000 years later. The technology kept changing, the governments kept changing, the land kept changing. The whole organization of the world kept changing. And so the oral law was really a process that would educate teachers and their students in a process and a manner of thinking, a manner of deriving information from scripture. So it was always meant to be taught. And even when we find it in writing and with all the footnotes and with all the elucidation, you still have to have knowledge of the process, knowledge of how to learn and to teach Talmud in order to understand what's going on here. Art Scroll and Koren have done an incredible job and spent millions of dollars gathering so many scholars together so that people like us can go into this book and start to understand quite a bit just from the book. But nevertheless, there's no substitute from learning, from people who really know what they're doing. And so that's why I'm definitely enjoying listening to the Daf Shiurim, the classes on the OU's app, All Daf. Last night I was listening to, I think his name is Ceruli Horowitz. He's excellent. Talks really fast. If I didn't have the background that I now have, after almost 20 years of learning, I couldn't follow what he's saying at all. But now I can follow it. And I learn a lot, and just sort of the way that things are approached. So the Talmud style is terse because it was an oral tradition, and often it gives you, and your mnemonic for remembering, gives you a list of things that you need to know, and it also tells you in your mnemonic for remembering this, and it gives you some kind of acrostic or anagram or something that's going to help you memorize this, because originally all of this was memorized. And it was memorized, and the memorization was taught, and then the way to unpack those memorized phrases was also taught. And so it's like a code. In the same way as the average person can't open up the US code of laws and just start reading laws and from reading that book know what laws the policemen are applying in the street in a given city on a given day. I mean, there's just so much more to it than what's simply contained in the law book. Jerome Joshua says, I love the teaching of speak less, but with clarity. It's great. It's great. Take a breath. Think about what you're going to say before you say it. That is wisdom right there. Okay, I believe that is it. Let me just check the YouTube side. Neil from Virginia says, does the writing have to have meaning to the writer or meaning in general? I say that's a really good question. In terms of the examples that are given, like the name Danielle, if you take the first two letters, Dalet Nun, that spells Don, which is a name. So all of these examples that are given is general meaning. But we've also encountered the principle several times that if something is significant for a person, because, for example, it's a little piece of, it's a button, it's something so small that other people wouldn't care about. But if he would store it, right, if he would bother storing this thing so that it doesn't get thrown away accidentally, so then he has demonstrated that it's significant to him. And if he demonstrated that it's significant to him, then he's going to be liable if he carries it from the private domain out into the public domain. So I would think that by analogy, one who writes something that might be gibberish to others, but is significant to him. So then it would be, it would qualify. It would meet the minimum measure for him, but not for others. That's my guess. I'm not sure about that. But that's my guess. Okay, that's what I've got. Sending you all big love from the West Coast, and look forward to meeting with you again tomorrow, because it's fun. Now that we're talking about writing, we're going to be talking about some rules of the sofer, some rules of the scribe who is writing a Torah scroll. We're going to do a little bit of a digression away from the laws of Shabbos to learn a little bit about the rules of writing a Torah. So look for that tomorrow. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers.